When I was very young, and I mean kindergarten, first grade, second grade, all I did was read. I have this amazing collection of Charlie Brown books, Peanuts, first editions from the early 60s. And it's funny because when I look at them now, what I've come to realize is the older I get, the more Charles Schulz was right about everything. But I love Snoopy. And I love getting up on that doghouse with him and chasing down the Red Baron, or crawling across the French farmlands in It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and all of that. And I had a deal with my mom that as long as I was getting straight A's, she'd let me bag school a lot. And I did. And I stayed home with my books. And I would read Charlie Brown, and I would read my comic books, and I would read The Wind in the Willows and some of the other great books. And I would write all the time. And I had this wonderful second grade teacher. I can't say enough about her. Her name is Lucy Scaramuzzi. And she used to encourage us to write our own books. And I remember writing all these Snoopy adventures for Lucy. And she would take this paste binding and actually turn them into little books. So see, I was a published author in second grade. I'll get back to that in a little bit, but this was my escape. It was my way of making sense of the world, as we were talking about Campbell. This was how I was making sense of the world, by reading these stories, by going on these adventures, by finding, horizons I didn't know existed as I grew up in Leominster. So something strange happened, however, along the way. I went to school, did well, but through those years of school, and I hate to say this, there are teachers here, elementary school, junior high school beat the love of reading right out of me. It really did. We weren't even reading adventure books or books. We were reading a paragraph of Faulkner to dissect it. And when I was in the 8th grade, I remember they gave me books to read like Ethan Frome and Silas Marner and Moby Dick. And I kept thinking, if you took 69 chapters out of Moby Dick, it would be a hell of a short story. I was in the 8th grade. I was playing football and baseball and basketball with my friends. I was learning there were girls out there. I was just starting to explore the world and find out what it was like. And none of these books held any relevance to me whatsoever. So reading became a job. It became a chore. And so did writing. I remember when I got to high school, there were only 1 or 2 times throughout my entire high school career that I actually cared about anything I wrote. And I remember one time I wrote this, we had to take something ugly and make it beautiful. And so I did this description of a swamp. And it was actually like a plastic factory pond down off of Weber Street in Leominster. And I did this description of it, and when I got done, the teacher, Miss Curley, just looked at me and she was crying. And I was like, wow, words have power. But anyway, and then the other class was I had a science fiction class with a man named Don Fred. And I had a lot of fun in that. I actually wrote a short story in his class that will come into this discussion a little bit later. But I hated writing, and I hated reading. Took my SATs, did really well, verbal and all of that, but my real strength was math. I had confidence in math. I enjoyed math. I began college undeclared at Fitchburg State but really I was a math computer science major. This is what I thought was going to be my life, and I was fine with that because I hated reading. So my freshman year, 1977, my sister, Susan, who's sitting right there and says I never give her credit, and I always do, gave me a Christmas present. Now in 1977, I was driving a 1969 Mercury Cougar with a 302 Boss and a 413 rear end, and I thought it was the coolest car ever, and it broke down every day. And so what I really wanted for Christmas was money. Well, my sister Susan gave me a gift, and it was like this. And I'm trying to unwrap it, and I'm like, well, it's not money. And I opened it up, and there was a white slipcase, and they had 4 books in it. And I'm looking at it and thinking, what? Why? And the name of the books were The Hobbit, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. And I had heard of them before, but I didn't really know what they were. You have to remember, this was 1977. Okay, 1977, there was no fantasy genre at the bookstore. If you went to a bookstore and looked in the one bay that was devoted to speculative fiction, fantasy and science fiction together, you saw Asimov, Bova, Clarke, Heinlein, all the great science fiction writers. Now in the corner they had Tolkien. And that was it. That was the entire fantasy section in most bookstores at that time. So I looked at it and I'm like, okay, what? And Susan looks at me and she says, just read it, you'll love it. And I said, a hobbit. What's a hobbit? And I remember Susan's like, well, it's like a dwarf, but they don't have beards, but they got furry feet. And I'm sitting there going, really? Yeah, but it's great because the dwarves, they go out to find their old home, and there's a dragon and there's magic. And I'm like, I need an alternator belt. So I just tossed it aside. I went in my room, you got to gather all your things and bring them up to your bedroom, and I threw the books off to the side. I didn't think anything of it. Went back to my math major classes up at Fitchburg State College. But something weird happened a couple of months after Christmas, 77. And I'm sure many people in this room remember February of 1978. If you're from New England, you know the great blizzard of 1978. And I remember that day, it was a Monday night, I was going to bed, and they said, we might get a little snow. Now, like anyone else going to school, I was, hey, maybe I won't have school tomorrow. I can fix my car or something. So I went to bed, and I woke up in the morning, and I looked out the window, and my car was missing. And I thought my car was stolen, because I could just see the driveway. And I freaked out, and I went running. And we had a little snow, but I didn't even carry him out, because my prized possession, my Cougar, was missing. So I went downstairs screaming, someone stole my car, and I looked out the window, and I realized that little black spot I saw wasn't the driveway, it was the roof of the car. That's all that was left. It was gone. And so I looked outside, and there's my dad at the end of the driveway, shoveling. But there's no road. He's shoveling like he worked for the post office. He took it seriously. And he's like this, shoveling the snow. And I go, oh, they put my clothes on. I go, oh, Dad, what are you doing? He goes, I got to get to work. I go, we live in South Leominster. You work in Fitchburg. There's no road. So he didn't go to work. And needless to say, I didn't have school for the entire week. As a matter of fact, if you remember that week, if you got caught on the roads, you were arrested. And I know this because I had to get up to Woodgate Farm and help my cousin Dave with the horses. So we had to take the snowmobiles. And we got chased, but they couldn't catch us. We had snowmobiles, there was no road. But so here I was, 19 years old and trapped in my mother's house. Oh, joy. But I wasn't trapped in my mother's house because I had nothing to do. And I didn't want to watch Mike Dukakis on any of the channels talking about the blizzard anymore. 4, 5, and 7, that was it. So I opened a book. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And I went, what? And I backed it up a little bit. And if you ever see that Valentine edition of The Hobbit, there is this wonderful foreword by a writer named Peter S. Beagle, who's still writing and is still just as wonderful. And Peter Beagle said, you should give him an award, really. He said, so many things that just resonated with me. Things like we are raised to honor all the wrong heroes, conquerors carrying flags, murderers bearing crosses. He said the word escapism wasn't a bad word. And I read that and I went, okay. In a hole in the ground, there was the hobbit. And I read the book. And I put on my Fleetwood Mac music. And I read the next book. And then I read the next book. And then I finished Return of the King. And then I went back. And I read The Hobbit again. And then I read the next book. And the next, and in that week that I was home out of school, I had read those 4 books 3 or 4 times. And I'm a very slow reader. I really am. I could not put those books down. And the whole time I'm reading them. I've got The Hobbit in my hand. And Peter Jackson better not mess up this movie, I'm telling you right now. But as I've got this book in my hand, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, why didn't anybody give me this book to read in the 8th grade? Why did they give me Silas Marner or Ethan Frome? Why didn't they give me this? And so when I got back to college the following week, first thing I did is declared my major, and it wasn't math, computer science. It was communications media, specializing in tech writing. Why? Because tech writing meant that I could stay in my safety net of math and science, because I'm going to have to work with engineers, so I'll be okay in this. But because of communications, all of my electives became literature courses, if I wanted. The whole world changed for me. Within a year, I was reading Chaucer in Middle English, reading Shakespeare, because now I was ready for Shakespeare and getting it. And I was reading Chaucer and laughing at all the right places. I got it. I was reading Dante. I was reading Joyce. I was reading all the classics. But I never stopped loving fantasy. Never, ever. So I graduated in 1981 with my degree, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go get a job in digital or Raytheon or one of the other high-tech companies as a tech writer. I had done really well in school and everything. But if you remember that time, a little recession hit pretty hard. It hit up here pretty hard, too. So I basically wound up working in the same plastics factory I had worked in up in Leominster to pay my way through college, and at the same bar I had been a bouncer in to pay my way through college. And that was, so my job every day was going to work, and I had this little metal stool by this big metal table with barrels full of lumps of scrap plastic. And my job every day was to load these into a grinder. And it was a really tough job because every 20 minutes you had to remember to change the barrel under the grinder or you'd get flakes of plastic all over the floor. And this was my job for 10 hours a day. And then I'd go to the Cinema Lounge. Some of you may remember the Cinema Lounge. I see embarrassed faces. I know why. I'd go to the Cinema Lounge at night and I would, you know, chase drunks out the door or whatever. And this was my life. And my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, because one of the things that really was bothering me is that I had run out of fantasy books to read. I had read all the Brooks books. I had read the Donaldson books. I had read McCaffrey. I had read Leiber. I had read Moorcock. In 1982, 83, that was about it. They really, I mean, I'm sure I could have found one. There was no internet in 1982. I was at the mercy of the local Pilgrim books and the local Walden books. That was, and the local library. So I had read all of the contemporary fantasy that was coming out, and I loved it, and I was out of books to read. And so my wife, then my girlfriend, said to me, well, why don't, you've been threatening to write one, why don't you? And so I took a story I had done in Dawn Fred's class, and I turned it into a book called Echoes of the Fourth Magic. And I sent it out, and I got, like every other author, I got some of the worst rejection letters you can imagine. I mean, one of them I remember said, "Dear Leonard." But I'm one of those guys, if you tell me I can't, I get mad and I'm going to prove you wrong, even in softball. So I stayed with it. Got married, kids came along, I landed a good job. I was working out at Genrad out in Bolton and Concord. And things were going well, but I kept writing. I kept working at my craft. And it was for me. And I never thought I was going to be a published author. I didn't write that book to become a published author. It's hard to explain, but I wrote that book so that my kids, or my grandkids, should tell my grandkids, if I ever had grandkids, they could hold up that book and say, this was your grandfather. This is what he did. So I was afraid of being a number, just a number. And I just wanted to do something to kind of separate me from that fate that I didn't want. But I kept at it, so I kept at it. Finally, in 1987, I had the book. I knew it was as good as I was going to make it. My edits had become 6 of one, half a dozen of the other type edits that every writer goes through and every writer should try very hard to avoid. So I sent it back out. And one of the places I sent it was a company called TSR. And they were known for the Dungeons and Dragons game. They were also known for a couple of very successful book lines, notably the Dragonlance books, which were all making New York Times bestseller at that time. And I went to my job, and I came home one day, and my wife says to me, someone from TSR called. I'm used to the little, we really love your work, good luck selling it somewhere else letters. And I said, called? Yeah, someone named Mary Burchoff called. So I'm thinking, did she ask for Leonard? No, she had asked for me. And she had left a number, and I called her back. Now I'm actually talking to her. And that was my break. They couldn't publish my book, but they had an opening for something they were working on, and could I either set this book in their world that they were creating for the game, or would I write a book for them? Would I audition to write a book for them? So that was my break. And you know, it's funny, to this day, the thing I remember most about that phone call is we had a dog. His name was Puddles, which he earned. And when I was on the phone, now remember, this was before cordless phones too, right? I mean, I was kind of strapped to the wall here, and Puddles wanted to go out. He's barking, and he's like barking and biting at my leg. Come on, let me out, let me out. And I'm like, Diane, let him out. And she's like, I can't, I got the kids. And it's like, and I remember in the middle of that phone that when I was finally realizing I was getting my break, Puddles peed on my foot. The things you remember. Anyway, fast forward now, and why this means so much to me. You know, when you're a writer, you get a lot of letters. And they all touch you. They're the reason you do what you do. They're the armor you wear against people with internet spine who are going to beat you up all the time. But they're also a reminder to you that you don't do what you do for royalty checks. Well, maybe a little. But you do what you do because of the privilege that being a writer allows you. Through your work, you are being let into the lives of other people. That is incredibly humbling. It is incredibly humbling to get a letter from someone that begins, I was diagnosed with cancer. And your books are helping me get through this. How do you answer that? Or to get a letter from a guy in Florida who'd been in a motorcycle accident, and he's a quadriplegic. And it says, I was about to tell my friend to pull the plug because I can't live like this. But then I thought of drizz't and what he went through. And if he can beat that, I can beat this. And then they get a follow-up letter 8 months later from the guy showing a picture of him smiling, lying on the bed with his pet parrot now sitting on his chest. He's now a writer for Windsurfer magazine. And you get these letters all the time, and you're being let into people's lives. I'm in Afghanistan. Thank you for letting me forget what I had to do today and not think about what I'm going to have to do tomorrow. And I remember in 2004, while you guys were all watching the Red Sox and wondering why the Yankees didn't just put them out of their misery before that great comeback, I was down in Virginia, and I went to Walter Reed. And I met soldiers who had taken my books overseas to share with their units, so to build unit cohesion. So everybody was reading the Dark Elf books. And these are guys who had just lost their legs. And things like, and the enormity of it overwhelms me. I'm amazed anybody even reads this stuff. Okay? But, and this is where it comes back to this award, given my own experiences, given how I got here, given what being a writer and a reader now means to me, the letters I like the most, and I get them all the time, are the ones that begin, I never read a book until. And then I know that I've done a little good in it. Because if anybody else reads one of my books and gets out of it what I got out of The Hobbit, I've done a good thing here. So thank you so much for this award. It really does mean it. Thank you.